I woke up because our energy reactor, a G2 class star we had been milking for the past 20 years, suddenly started screaming. No joke, it was actually screaming, and on every frequency at once. Radio, gravitational waves, even the neutrino flux turned into something like Morse code. I was the duty operator on the Helios 7 station, floating 300,000 kilometers from the photosphere, sipping synthetic coffee and thinking about my upcoming vacation in a week when all the sensors went haywire. The star's core temperature spiked by 4 million degrees in a second. Its magnetic lines twisted into a braid, and something enormous and glowing started emerging from the corona. Something that was definitely not a solar flare. My first thought was utterly stupid. What if the star was pregnant and having contractions? The second thought was worse, because when that something unfolded, I realized it had eyes. Massive eyes, the size of the moon, woven from pure plasma, and they were staring right at me. The station shook like we had been thrown into a blender. Emergency sirens blared at full volume, and then a voice burst into my helmet, ancient as the universe itself, but incredibly annoyed, like a neighbor woken up at 3 a.m. by someone drilling through the wall. The voice spoke in a language I'd never heard before, but somehow every word imprinted itself directly into my mind, bypassing my ears entirely. They called themselves the Solar Architects. They said they had been sleeping inside the star for the past 3 million years, and we humans, with our ridiculous energy pumps, had woken them up early. Then, it got even stranger. Apparently, all stars within 1,000 light years were their property, their sacred temples, their homes. And for the past 2 centuries, we'd basically been barging into their bedrooms and stealing electricity. Imagine waking up to find a bunch of ants sitting in your room, drilling a straw into your side to sip your blood. That's pretty much how they saw us. The architect said humanity had 100 Earth days to clear out from all their stars, or they'd start forcing us out. And judging by the size of the plasma creature floating before me, they had all the means to do it. I tried to contact Earth, but the signal was a mess. Their awakening must have created some kind of interference. When I finally broke through, I realized the problem wasn't just ours. All 10 major galactic energy sectors were receiving the exact same message. The architects were waking up everywhere, all at once, as if someone had set off a galaxy-wide alarm clock. At first, Command thought it was a mass hallucination or some kind of system virus. But when the first station in the Alpha sector simply evaporated, literally turned into a cloud of ionized metal in 3 seconds, everyone understood the joke was over. The architects began showing their power. They were shaping enormous beings from stellar plasma, like dragons out of old myths, only made of pure light and magma. These creatures could pass through our shields like butter, swim inside stars as easily as we swim in water, and radiate such heat that our sensors refused to display the numbers. I floated there in my tin can, staring at a plasma titan the size of a small planet, thinking only one thing. My vacation was definitely ruined. The worst part was that the architects were right, and deep down, I knew it. We really had come, stuck our pipes into their stars, and started draining energy without even wondering if something might live there. Classic human behavior. Take first, think later, then act surprised when everyone's angry. When the station was evacuated and we flew away from the star, I looked back and saw dozens of those plasma beings circling it, guarding it. They moved with an odd grace, almost tenderness. And it hit me. What if to them, stars weren't just reactors or homes, but something more? What if we'd been feeding on living beings all this time without realizing it? That thought haunted me all the way back to Earth. And when I heard the generals drawing up war plans, the politicians shouting about our right to energy, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were about to make the biggest mistake in human history. A week after the architect's ultimatum, I found myself at an emergency session of the Interstellar Council, and the atmosphere there was like sitting on a powder keg with the fuse already lit. I, Marina Solovi, a xenoarchaeologist, had been summoned as an expert on ancient civilizations, though normally my reports on shards and ruins interested only 3 colleagues and 1 eccentric professor. But now, everything had changed. The hall was packed with delegates from every colony, each shouting louder than the other. General Castro, head of the militarist faction, was pounding his fist on the table and demanding an immediate preemptive strike on the stars where the architects had been detected. His plan was as simple as a hammer: launch a massive nuclear gravitational assault before they fully recovered from awakening. Across from him sat the diplomats led by Ambassador Chen, who insisted on negotiations, arguing that any act of aggression would mean humanity's genocide. And in the corner, the colonists led by old Weber were pushing for a third option: an immediate evacuation of all energy stations, the development of alternative energy sources, and the search for new, uninhabited stars on the edge of the galaxy. I listened to the chaos and knew no one wanted to hear the truth I'd uncovered 3 days earlier in the archives of the ancient Forerunner civilization on Chiron 9. When it was finally my turn to speak, silence fell. Not out of respect, but simply because everyone was tired of shouting. I activated the holoprojector and showed them the discovery: a data array 4.5 billion years old, recorded on crystalline storage that had survived the birth and death of dozens of civilizations. Encoded within its quantum structure was the history of the solar architects, and it turned everything upside down. It turned out that the stars we had been using as reactors hadn't formed naturally. The architects had created them billions of years ago, using technology beyond our comprehension. They gathered clouds of hydrogen, initiated thermonuclear fusion, balanced gravity and magnetic fields. In essence, cultivating stars the way farmers grow crops. Each star was their creation, their masterpiece, their child. I saw schematics, equations, even what seemed to be emotional markers embedded in the data. They didn't just live in the stars, they loved them. When I finished the presentation, the room erupted again, though this time with words instead of fists. General Castro claimed it didn't change the fact that the architects threatened our survival, and that if they had made the stars, we had every right to use them. Ownership rights expire after billions of years, he said. Ambassador Chen countered that it was like breaking into someone's home, stealing their family heirlooms, and claiming they were too old to belong to anyone. Weber and his colonists shook their heads and repeated that we should just leave while we still could. The galaxy was vast, and we'd find other energy sources. I tried to explain that it wasn't just about ownership. The data showed that the architects weren't just builders, they were caretakers, maintaining galactic balance, preventing collapses in supernovae, sustaining life on billions of worlds. If we started a war and destroyed them, we could unravel a system that had been functioning long before the first human existed. But no one listened. Every faction had already chosen its stance and refused to back down. By the end of the session, the council was completely divided. 30% of delegates voted for military action, 40% for negotiations, and the rest supported evacuation. That meant total paralysis, no unified decision, leaving each sector to act on its own. I left the chamber with a heavy weight in my chest, realizing we were heading not only for a war with the architects, but for a civil war within humanity itself. In the elevator, I was caught up by a young technician from the Helios 7 station, the same guy who'd first witnessed the architects' awakening. He said he believed me, that he'd read my report and understood what we'd done. Then he pulled a small memory crystal from his pocket and handed it to me. It contained the coordinates of an ancient architect's temple on the edge of the system, unknown to the authorities. He told me that if I truly wanted to understand who the architects were and how to stop the coming catastrophe, I had to go there. I took the crystal, and at that moment, I realized my quiet life as an archaeologist was over. I was now at the heart of a conflict that could destroy everything humanity had built in the past 1,000 years. The negotiations collapsed on the 62nd day after the ultimatum, and I found out in the worst possible way. by watching the sky burn over the colony of New Eden. I was there on business, studying ancient artifacts in the university lab, when all communicators suddenly screamed with an emergency alert, and a second later, the planet's defense field flared bright red, a sign of an incoming massive attack. I ran outside and saw something I'll never forget. Our star, a calm yellow dwarf that had lit our world for 20 years, began to pulse like a sick heart. From its corona, enormous figures made of pure light and fire began to emerge. They were the architect's battle constructs, materializing directly from stellar plasma, appearing out of nothing as if the star itself was giving birth to an army. The first construct was the size of a city, resembling a three-headed winged serpent, with each scale radiating temperatures of millions of degrees. It turned and headed straight for our defensive station, Shield 3, which hung between the planet and the star, bristling with hundreds of gun turrets and missile batteries. The station fired first. I saw thousands of projectiles and energy beams hit the plasma serpent, but it was like spitting into the ocean. The construct didn't even slow down. It passed through the barrage as if it wasn't there, then opened its jaws and released a stream of concentrated stellar plasma. The heat was so intense that the station's shields didn't even resist. They just vanished like morning dew under sunlight. The station itself was cut in half in 3 seconds. The metal vaporized instantly, and where a massive combat complex with a crew of 2,000 had been a moment earlier, only a spreading cloud of ionized particles remained. I stood on the planet's surface, frozen, my brain refusing to process what was happening. News channels began reporting from other sectors. The same thing was occurring simultaneously in 10 key human systems. The architects had launched a coordinated strike, and we finally understood that the 100 days they'd given us hadn't been a negotiation. It was a final warning we chose to ignore. The second construct emerged from the star a minute later, even larger. A gigantic humanoid titan, hundreds of kilometers tall, with 4 arms and a face of pure white fire. It moved toward our second defensive line, where the Commonwealth fleet's cruisers and destroyers stood, 20 warships, each the size of a small moon, armed with the latest military tech. They tried using gravitational torpedoes designed to create micro-black holes that could tear the enemy apart. But when the torpedoes reached the Titan, it simply clapped its hands, and a shockwave of compressed plasma swept them away like annoying insects. Then, the Titan extended a hand toward the nearest cruiser and clenched its fist. I saw it live on the big city screens. And the ship folded in half like a tin can. Its reactor exploded, taking 3 more ships with it. The entire battle lasted 7 minutes, and when it was over, nothing was left of our fleet in that sector but wreckage and radiation. The architects didn't even seem strained. Their constructs moved with slow, inevitable precision, like a natural disaster that couldn't be stopped. Panic on the planet was instant. People ran for the evacuation shuttles, trampling each other, screaming, praying. Some just sat on sidewalks and cried. I tried to reach the spaceport, but the crowd was impenetrable. I was stuck in the chaos, watching plasma monsters circling above us as if deciding whether to destroy the planet itself or just our military bases. At one point, a smaller construct, a fiery bird the size of a mountain, dove down and vaporized a military base on the city's outskirts with a single touch. The shockwave knocked me off my feet. The heat was so intense that asphalt melted a kilometer from the blast, and a mushroom cloud rose into the stratosphere. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the architects stopped. Their constructs froze in the sky, and a message came from the star, one every person in the system heard directly in their mind. The voice was cold and endlessly weary. It said this was only a demonstration, that we had 38 days left before the final cleansing, and if we didn't leave willingly, they would erase every human station, ship, and colony in the systems that belonged to them. I lay on the shattered street, staring at the fiery titans above, thinking only one thing: We'd lost this war before it even started, because we were fighting beings for whom stars were home, and we were just insects foolish enough to bite a god. 2 weeks after the first massacre, the military engineers accomplished what had once seemed impossible. They created ships capable of diving straight into stars. I was assigned to the scientific division of Project Icarus because my knowledge of the architects proved critical to understanding how to survive in their native environment. I first saw the prototype at a secret shipyard in the Tantalus system, a vessel that looked like a 300-meter drop of mercury, sheathed in layers of exotic matter and surrounded by a magnetic field so intense that tools and bits of metal floated around it. The chief engineer, a woman named Rachel Kimura, explained the principle. The ship generated a magnetic plasma cocoon that repelled stellar matter while simultaneously drawing power from it to sustain the barrier. In essence, the deeper the ship plunged into the star, the stronger its protection became. It was both brilliant and insane, because a single system failure would instantly vaporize the entire crew in a furnace of 15 million degrees. To pilot these ships, they selected the most reckless individuals from every human fleet, people with nothing left to lose, adrenaline junkies, ex-criminals, and those who had lost their families in the architects' first attacks. They were called the Divers, and I witnessed their training on the Ganymede base. The first squadron's commander was Captain Marcus Vale, a former fighter pilot who'd lost his wife and daughter when the architects erased a station in the Centauri sector. His eyes had that hollow look of a man already dead inside, though he hadn't realized it yet. When he spoke about combat tactics inside a star, his tone was calm, almost casual, like he was discussing a pie recipe instead of a suicide mission. The training was brutal. Pilots learned to navigate through chaotic plasma currents where sensors failed, gravity shifted every second, and magnetic storms could hurl a ship thousands of kilometers in an instant. Their first combat mission took place in the Alpha Wolf system, where the architects had deployed 3 plasma leviathans, colossal constructs patrolling the stellar corona, destroying any human presence within a light hour's range. I watched the operation from the command center, my heart pounding so loud I could hear it in my ears. 5 diver ships entered the star's photosphere from different angles. Their signals distorted and vanished in plasma storms, leaving us with only fragments of telemetry and static. What followed was perhaps the strangest battle in human history: guerrilla warfare inside a living sun. The ships hid within solar flares, used magnetic lines for cover, and struck the leviathans with bursts from plasma harpoons that siphoned energy straight from the star before vanishing into convection currents, too fast for the monsters to retaliate. One leviathan, a serpent-like creature 50,000 kilometers long, took the bait and pursued Vale's ship into a zone of magnetic instability where the collision of fields caused an explosion that tore the construct apart. Out of 5 ships, 3 returned, but the mission was hailed as a monumental victory. For the first time, humanity had destroyed an architect war construct and proved we could fight on their ground. When Captain Vale emerged from his vessel, his suit was half melted, his face burned, and his eyes burned with a feverish glow. He said that inside the star, he saw things beyond description, that in the core, where temperatures reached billions of degrees, lived beings we had never imagined, and that the architects were only the tip of the iceberg. After that, the divers became legend. Squadrons formed across every sector, with volunteers lining up for a chance to pilot these coffin ships. A true guerrilla war erupted across the crowns of dozens of stars. We learned to strike the architects where they thought themselves invincible, to survive in hell, to turn the stars themselves into our weapons. But deep down, I knew this only delayed the inevitable, because the architects numbered in the millions, and our mad heroes only a few hundred. Every mission could be their last. The breakthrough came on the 48th day of the war, when I finally reached the ancient temple of the architects, the one whose coordinates had been given to me by a technician from the Helios 7 station. The temple stood on a dead moon in the Eridanus system, in a place where gravitational anomalies made navigation nearly impossible, which explained why no one had found it before. When I entered, I saw a hall the size of a stadium, its walls glowing with millions of tiny symbols that shifted and pulsed in rhythm with some invisible beat. It wasn't just writing. It was a living archive, a quantum memory inscribed into the very fabric of space-time. I connected my decoder, and data flooded in. Terabytes of information gathered over billions of years. What I saw in the first few minutes made me collapse to the floor. The architects hadn't created stars. They had cultivated them, like gardeners tending trees, because stars were living beings. The data showed the process in detail. Young stars formed naturally from clouds of hydrogen, but they were primitive, unstable, dangerous. The architects came to these newborn suns and began the long process of cultivation, tuning their magnetic fields, balancing fusion reactions, teaching them to control their flares and eruptions. I saw records resembling training manuals, how a young star learned to breathe evenly, how it grew under the architect's care, and how, over time, something like consciousness began to awaken within it. Slow, vast, stretched across eons, but undeniably sentient. Stars thought on timescales of millions of years. One of their thoughts could last centuries. But they did think, they felt, they lived. And we, humans, for the past 200 years, had been plunging our energy harvesters into them, draining their life force, slowly killing sentient beings for electricity. I sat in that temple and wept, realizing the magnitude of what we had done. The records showed how stars communicated with the architects through gravitational waves and neutrino streams, how they sang their slow songs into the void, how they rejoiced at the birth of new planets in their systems and mourned when one died in a supernova. The architects weren't masters of the stars. They were their friends, their guardians, their shepherds in the noblest sense of the word. They monitored their health, healed them when magnetic storms spiraled out of control, helped them through crises, and prevented premature collapses. And when the time came for a star to die naturally, to become a supernova or a white dwarf, the architects held what could only be described as funerals. The last records in the archive showed a farewell ceremony for a star named Alderamin, which had lived for 11 billion years and faded surrounded by those who had cared for it all its life. I immediately transmitted the data to the council, the scientific community, the news networks, everywhere I could. The reaction was explosive. Half of humanity fell into shock upon realizing we had been committing mass murder of sentient beings without ever knowing it. Religious groups declared we were cursed and must stop using stellar energy at once, begging forgiveness from the architects. Scientists split into two camps. Some confirmed my findings and demanded a moratorium on energy extraction, while others argued that stellar consciousness was too primitive to be considered true intelligence, claiming we had every right to use stars just as we use animals for food. Protests and counter-protests erupted on the streets. People fought, some demanding peace with the architects, others shouting that without stellar energy, billions would die, that we had no alternative, that humanity's survival outweighed the lives of plasma entities. Watching this divide, I realized I had opened Pandora's box. This was no longer a war over territory or resources. It had become a question of morality, ethics, and the very nature of who we are, and what place we hold in a universe filled with minds we never learned to recognize. 3 days after I released my data, mass desertions began across the fleet, and for the first time, I saw humanity tearing itself apart from within. The first to defect was the destroyer Prometheus, along with its 800-person crew. Captain Sarah Nguyen went live on all channels and declared that she would no longer take part in the genocide of sentient beings, that every shot fired at the architects and their stars weighed heavily on her conscience. Others soon followed. Divers units refused to fly combat missions, pilots sabotaged their own ships, entire garrisons abandoned their posts and fled to neutral systems. Military command tried to stop the wave of desertions with executions, but that only made things worse. When 5 refusers were shot on Bastion 12th Station, their comrades rioted, seized the armory, and escaped, taking 2 frigates and an arsenal with them. I received messages from deserters every day. They thanked me for revealing the truth and said they could no longer kill, knowing their targets were alive and intelligent. But the other half of the military only grew more ruthless, led by Admiral Castro, a man who had lost 3 sons in the Architect's attacks and had turned his grief into cold, methodical determination. I learned about his plan by accident. One of my former students, now working in intelligence, sent me an encrypted message with coordinates and schematics for an operation codenamed Sunset. Castro had found the Architect's homeworld, a neutron star in the PSR J0348 system, an incredibly dense remnant of a supernova, spinning at tremendous speed and emitting colossal magnetic fields. The data showed that inside this neutron star, under unimaginable pressure and heat, lived a colony of architects, possibly their central hive, their capital, the place where they were born and where they returned to die. Castro planned to use an experimental weapon, a gravitational destabilizer capable of disrupting the neutron star's balance and triggering its collapse into a black hole, annihilating everything within it in a fraction of a second. I knew I had to stop him, even if it made me a traitor in the eyes of billions. I stole a shuttle from the research station where I worked and headed to the Eridanus system, where the deserters were gathering. There, I met Captain Vale and the remnants of his divers squad, who had also refused to keep fighting. I showed them Castro's plan, and Vale looked at me with eyes full of fury and despair. He said he hated the Architects for killing his wife and daughter, that every cell in his body screamed for revenge, but he couldn't allow the genocide of an entire race, because then we'd become worse than any monsters. We assembled a flotilla of 12 ships, a pitiful handful against Castro's armada, but it was all we had. News of our plan leaked online, and the reaction was immediate. I was branded an enemy of humanity, a traitor, a collaborator. A bounty was placed on my head, my academic titles were revoked, and my parents sent a message disowning me. We raced toward the PSR J0348 system at maximum speed, knowing we were already too late. Castro's fleet was there, 100 warships encircling the neutron star, preparing to deploy the destabilizer. I tried to contact the admiral, begged him to stop, explaining that this wouldn't end the conflict but would make us genocidal murderers, forever stripped of moral legitimacy. Castro answered with a voice full of cold contempt. He said I was a naive fool who didn't understand the reality of war, that the Architects had killed millions of humans and deserved extinction, that history is written by the victors, and if humanity survived because of this strike, no one would remember any moral doubts. Then he cut the transmission and gave the order to activate the destabilizer. I watched as the device descended into the neutron star's magnetosphere, spinning up a gravitational resonance, and I knew that in 10 minutes, billions of Architects would die, and I was powerless to stop it. In despair, I did the only thing left. I sent a distress signal directly to the Architects, told them about Castro's plan, and asked forgiveness on behalf of the part of humanity that still had a conscience, knowing it was probably the last thing I would ever do. The Architects responded to my signal in a way I never expected. They teleported our small flotilla straight into the Triad system, a triple star system where 3 giants, red, yellow, and blue, spun in a complex gravitational dance only a few million kilometers apart. A battle was already raging there. The main Commonwealth fleet under Marshal Wang was clashing with the largest army of Architects humanity had ever encountered. Thousands of plasma constructs filled the space between the stars, turning the system into a glowing inferno. But that wasn't the worst part. I saw on the scanners that human ships had deployed massive gravitational generators between the stars and were shaking their orbits, creating a resonance that could tear the entire system apart. Wang had decided to use the stars themselves as a doomsday weapon. If the resonance reached a critical point, all three stars would go unstable and explode like supernovae, obliterating everything within a light-year's radius, including hundreds of human colonies and billions of architects. Captain Vale shouted into the communicator, trying to reach Wang, to explain that it was madness, that the explosion of three supernovae would trigger a chain reaction, destabilizing dozens of nearby systems and turning the entire sector into a dead zone for thousands of years. But Wang was resolute. He said it was the only way to stop the architects once and for all, that humanity must show its strength, no matter how horrifying the cost. I saw the gravitational generators running at full power, the orbits of the stars stretching and warping, giant prominences erupting from the red giant's surface, flinging matter into space. The temperature between the stars rose every second, magnetic fields twisted into a monstrous knot, and I knew that in 5 minutes the irreversible cascade would begin. The architects tried to attack the generators, but the human fleet shielded them with a dense barrage of fire, and every destroyed construct was replaced by 2 new ships. And then it happened. Something I will remember for the rest of my life. The architects stopped their attack. They simply halted in space, and from the center of their formation emerged a construct unlike any other. A colossal being that looked like an ancient elder woven from white light, streaked with golden plasma. It didn't move toward the human ships, but toward the stars, and thousands of other architects followed it, diving straight into the coronae of the 3 suns and doing something unimaginable. I saw in the telemetry how they formed living chains inside the stars, linking their bodies into a single network that absorbed excess energy and dampened the resonance. They were sacrificing themselves, turning their plasma forms into stabilizers. Each act of self-sacrifice saving a star from collapse, but killing an architect. I saw them burn brighter than the suns themselves, their consciousness fading one by one, and I heard their final song, a mournful melody in the neutrino frequencies caught by our sensors. The human fleet froze in shock. Even the fiercest soldiers couldn't believe what they were seeing. The enemies were saving their lives at the cost of their own. Marshal Wang ordered the generators shut down, his voice trembling as he gave the command, and I realized something had broken inside that ruthless man. The battle ended on its own. Ships on both sides simply stopped, watching as the last architects completed the stabilization of the stars. Of the 3,000 constructs that dove into the suns, only 200 returned. The rest dissolved in plasma, giving their lives to prevent a catastrophe that would have wiped out both civilizations. The elder architect, who had led the sacrifice, appeared before Wang's flagship, his form barely holding together, flickering and fading. And he spoke his final words directly into the mind of every human in the system. He said the architects did not seek humanity's destruction, that they understood our need for energy, but could not allow the murder of stars, sentient beings they had protected for billions of years. Then he asked if we were truly so blind that we couldn't see another path, one where both races could exist without destroying each other. And then he dissolved into space, leaving us alone with our shame and the realization that our enemies had been nobler than we were. After the battle at the Triad, something in the soul of humanity broke, and I found myself at the center of a movement I never intended to start. People began coming to me from all corners of inhabited space. Soldiers who could no longer pull the trigger, engineers from energy stations tormented by conscience, ordinary colonists shaken by the architect's self-sacrifice. We met at the neutral station Refuge in the Barnard system, and there, in an overcrowded hall with more than 10,000 people, I proposed creating an organization to protect the stars and seek a path to peace. We called ourselves the Keepers of the Light, and our goal was simple and insane at the same time: stop the exploitation of sentient stars, even if it meant sabotaging our own civilization. Captain Vale became my deputy, and the former engineer from Helios 7, the same guy who gave me the temple coordinates, headed the technical wing of our movement. The first sabotage actions began a week later, and they were surgically precise. Our people working at energy stations disabled key extraction systems in ways that looked like technical failures. At Prometheus 4 Sears, the main pump failed, and energy output dropped by 80%. At Helios 12 Theer, the cooling system suddenly went down, and the station had to be evacuated. We did not kill people, that was our primary rule. We simply stopped the genocide machine bolt by bolt. But Command quickly realized these were not accidents, and a hunt for saboteurs began. Admiral Castro, who survived the failed operation at the Neutron Star, led a special task force against the traitors. He publicly declared that every keeper caught would be executed without trial and their families stripped of citizenship and deported to frontier colonies. The first arrests were brutal. I saw footage of 3 of our engineers being grabbed on Phaeton Station, beaten on camera, and thrown into an airlock without suits. That only hardened both sides. Humanity split into 2 irreconcilable camps, and a real civil war began. On one side were the militarists and pragmatists who argued that without stellar energy, billions would die, that there were no alternatives, and that the survival of the species outweighed the lives of plasma beings we couldn't properly understand. On the other side were us, the Keepers, and everyone who couldn't live with the idea of genocide, who believed a civilization built on killing sentient beings did not deserve to exist. Battles erupted on dozens of stations. The Keepers seized energy complexes and shut them down. The military stormed those complexes back, and people died on both sides. On the colony, New Venice, a real fight broke out. 5,000 Keepers barricaded themselves inside the main power plant, while the army surrounded them and threatened artillery bombardment. I went there myself, slipped through the blockade, and went out to negotiate with the commander, a colonel who had lost his son in the Architect's attacks and hated me with all his being. We stood opposite each other on neutral ground, and he asked me if I understood that I was condemning millions who depended on that energy to death, that children in hospitals would die when the power went out, that whole cities would be plunged into cold and darkness. I answered that I understood, and it tore my heart apart. But if we continued killing stars, we would become a parasitic race unfit for a place in space, and we had to find another path, even if it was painful and difficult. He looked at me with such contempt that I felt physical pain, called me a fanatic and an idealist divorced from reality, and ordered the assault to begin in an hour. I returned to our barricades, knowing many of us would die, but at the last moment, something unexpected happened. A third of the soldiers in his own unit refused to fire and switched to our side. The colonel stood in the middle of the battlefield, surrounded by deserters from his own army, and I watched him slowly lower his weapon, realizing that the war was no longer between humanity and the Architects. It was inside us, and the only way to win it was to find a path that could reconcile both sides of our divided species. The breakthrough came where I least expected it, in the system of a young star on the edge of known space, where the Architects themselves led me. They sent coordinates and a strange message. If I wanted to understand the truth, I had to hear the voice of the star itself. I arrived there in a small shuttle, alone, because the Architects said the star was too young and timid to handle the presence of a large fleet. The star was tiny by cosmic standards, a yellow dwarf only 50 million years old, young by stellar measure, just beginning its journey. The Architects called her Alcifina, which in their language meant first light of dawn, and when I approached her corona in a specially shielded craft, they helped me establish contact. It felt like diving into an ocean of light. I sensed the presence of a vast, curious, and incredibly young mind studying me as intently as I studied it. Alcifina didn't speak in words, but in images and sensations that flared directly in my mind. I felt her joy at existing, her wonder at the infinity of space, her fear of the darkness between stars, and deep gratitude to the architects who had taught her to control her energy and not explode in a chaotic flare. She showed me how she perceived the world. Time flowed for her differently. A second was a blink, a year, a brief breath. She saw gravitational waves the way we see light, felt every particle in her plasma the way we feel every cell in our body. Then she shared a memory, painful and frightening, of how a few years earlier a human reconnaissance probe had entered her corona and started draining her energy. Alcefina didn't understand what was happening, only felt pain and fear, as if someone had pierced her body and started drinking her blood. The architects drove the probe away, but the fear remained, and since then, the young star had been afraid of all outsiders. I cried as I felt her pain and tried to explain, through images, since words were useless, that humans didn't know they were causing suffering, that we simply didn't understand the stars were alive and intelligent. Alcefina was puzzled. How could someone not recognize life? For her, it was as obvious as it is for us that another human is a sentient being. Then she asked, and that question changed everything. Why do humans take energy by force when they could simply ask? She showed me how excess energy made her uncomfortable, how at times she swelled with it and had to eject flares into space, losing valuable matter. If someone helped her balance that excess by drawing energy carefully and gently, it would benefit both sides. I couldn't believe the simplicity of it. We had fought, killed each other, torn our civilization apart, and all we needed to do was ask for permission. I immediately contacted the architects and relayed Alcefina's idea, and their response was instant. They were ready for a truce under new terms. The eldest surviving architects from the Triad battle gathered for council and proposed a treaty. Humanity would dismantle all forced energy harvesting stations, and in return, the architects would teach us symbiotic energy exchange, a technology allowing us to gather excess stellar energy with the stars' consent, without pain or disruption. Moreover, the stars would receive what they had lacked for billions of years: protection from cosmic threats, roaming black holes, gamma bursts, collisions with other stars. Humanity would become their protectors, their guardians, and they, our willing energy donors. I broadcast the proposal across all human colonies, and the reaction was overwhelming. Even the most hardened militarists realized it was a chance to end the war without dooming our species. Admiral Castro, to my surprise, supported the treaty. He said he was tired of blood and ready to try another way if it meant his grandchildren could live in peace. A month after the contact with Alcefina, we signed the Crown Pact on a neutral station in the presence of representatives from both species, and for the first time in a year of war, I felt something close to hope. The signing ceremony of the crowning pact didn't take place in a grand hall or on a flagship, but in open space at the heart of the Alcefina system, a young star that had unintentionally become a symbol of our new beginning. Hundreds of ships from both sides gathered around it, human dreadnoughts alongside the plasma constructs of the architects, former enemies who, just a month ago, had tried to destroy each other. I stood on the command bridge of the flagship Concord, dressed in a simple white suit without any insignia, and felt my heart pounding as I read the treaty aloud across all frequencies. Humanity pledged to dismantle all forced energy stations within 5 years, compensate the stars harmed by our actions, and never again use sentient suns as soulless resources. In return, the architects shared their knowledge of symbiotic energy exchange, technologies of harmonious interaction with stars, and, most importantly, taught the first group of humans the art of hearing the songs of stars, an ancient way of communicating with plasma-based consciousness. Alcefina was present during the ceremony, and when the treaty was signed, she flared brighter than usual, her way of showing joy. I could feel her emotions through our established link: relief that the war was over, hope for a future where young stars wouldn't fear outsiders, and even a hint of pride that her voice had helped find the path to peace. The architects performed a ceremonial dance, their plasma forms intertwining in complex patterns around the star, creating a light show that was both art and a prayer of gratitude to the sun for its patience toward the ignorant younger races. I saw even the sternest soldiers among the human delegates cry. Admiral Castro stood at attention, tears running down his scarred face as he realized how many lives could have been saved if we had tried to understand instead of conquer. After the ceremony came the most important part of my new life. The architects chose me to establish the first school of star empaths, humans capable of communicating with living suns and serving as intermediaries between our races. We founded the academy on the Dawn Station in the Alsafina system, where the first 50 candidates arrived, people with a special sensitivity to energy fields, able to perceive subtle shifts in space-time. Among them was the young technician from the Helios 17 station who had first witnessed the awakening of the architects and given me the coordinates of the ancient temple, Captain Vale, who found healing from his family's loss through this new path, and even several former soldiers from the divers squads who had already felt the stars but had never tried to speak to them. Training was both painful and beautiful. The architects taught us to expand perception beyond human senses, to slow our thoughts to the pace of stellar time, where a second becomes an eternity, and to see not with eyes, but with our whole being. The first time I truly heard Alsafina's song, not fragments or images, but a full, conscious communication, I lost consciousness from the overload. It felt as if an ocean of light had been poured into my mind, every drop a separate thought, emotion, or memory millions of years old. When I woke up, the eldest architect stood over me in its luminous form and said I had done better than any human before me, that I possessed a rare gift, not just to hear the stars, but to understand the depth of their ancient wisdom. Over the next 6 months, we, the first empaths, learned to translate the desires of stars into human language and back, becoming a bridge between two forms of intelligence so different that their union once seemed impossible. Our first real mission took us to the edge of the galaxy, where a young star had begun to pulse erratically and risked premature collapse. We arrived, established contact, calmed the frightened sun, and helped the architects stabilize its core, saving not only the star, but also 3 inhabited planets in its system. When the news spread across human space, the skeptics who had called the crowning pact a mistake finally fell silent. We had proven that this new path worked, that symbiosis was possible, and that civilization could evolve without destroying those who were different. And I, a simple archaeologist who once dug through the relics of dead civilizations, became a teacher of a new era, one in which humanity finally learned to listen to the voices of the universe.